My name is Dr. Ashley Riley Sousa. I've been teaching now for almost 6 years. At the end of the semester, I'll have been here 6 years.
6 years. How long have you been teaching in general?
I've been in the classroom in some way or another for, since 2003. So that's 16 years. Good Lord. I'm not a math teacher. Yeah, 16 years in some capacity or another. So I chose to go into history, I think, bottom line, because I'm a very argumentative person. I like to argue, and I like to win arguments. And so, in history, that's really kind of how that works. You find evidence, you back up a position. You have to adjust your position based on the evidence, but basically you get to dig in and be like, this is how it is, or how it was. I really liked being argumentative, and also I think history is inherently political, and I also I like political arguments. But I always wanted to be able to win Thanksgiving table arguments with nutty relatives. So on paper, I am a historian of Native North America, and I'm a historian of the American West. But really, in my heart, I'm a historian of California, and that's because that's where I grew up. And when I was thinking about in graduate school, what do I want to study? What could be so intriguing to me, or something that I was so passionate about that I could spend years and years of my life, engaging that research and doing that writing. For me, it ended up being, trying to get as close to writing the history of my backyard as possible, right? I wanted to get down to right where I am from. And I almost did that in my dissertation. I got within an hour of where I was born and grew up, so I feel like I did pretty well with that. So for me, it's where am I in the world, chronologically, in terms of how do I fall in the timeline of history? How does my family fall in the timeline of history? What big historical trajectories and trends and processes were we involved in? Right. So that's always fascinated me. It's a very personal thing for me. So I first became obsessed with the Black Dahlia case. Oddly enough, it was while I was writing my dissertation, which is about Native Americans in 19th century California. But I got interested in it sort of in a true crime kind of way. And so I started reading everything that I could about the Black Dahlia, and much of it is junk. And that's how I realized that there was sort of a niche in the market of historical scholarship for serious writing about the Black Dahlia case. I read this really horrible, campy true crime book called Severed, that was sort of really gruesome, murder photos and autopsy photos and these kinds of things. And at the time I was pregnant with my youngest daughter, and I think it got to be too much, and I couldn't, I became so obsessed with it, and it burned really hot and bright, and then I had to kind of set it down and walk away from it, because it's a disturbing story. So for those of you who don't know, the Black Dahlia murder was a murder that was committed in Los Angeles in 1947, January of 1947, where a young woman, 21 years old, was murdered by we don't know who. And her body was horribly mutilated and dumped in a residential neighborhood in a vacant lot just outside of downtown Los Angeles. And it was a very sensationalized story. The press was all over it. And one of the interesting things about it to me as a historical event, and something that people have continued to think about, is the way that it's taken on a sort of life of its own, in terms of there are movies been made about it, there's books been written about it. Right now there's both a TV show and a podcast about the Black Dahlia case. And we can't let it go. The American public can't let go of this case and its imagination. And there's a whole mythology that's arisen about the Black Dahlia. Her name was Elizabeth Short, and she was, by all accounts, and there aren't very many because not very many people knew very much about her, including her own family. By all accounts, she was sort of a drifter, didn't really have a fixed job or a home, seemed to sort of live this rough lifestyle kind of on the margins of society. But in the public imagination, this mythology develops around her, where she is a Hollywood starlet, this beautiful sort of beauty queen type, glamorous, sort of this wonderful life in the making that was tragically cut short by this murder, when in reality she was, and you don't ever want to say somebody is the type of person to get murdered, but she's the type of person who lived on the margins of society that are often victims of violence. But we've invented, or society has invented, this myth about her in the public imagination. And horrific violence is committed against women all the time in the United States, but very seldom does it become elevated in the popular imagination in the way that that the Elizabeth Short / Black Dahlia murder has become. So I'm really fascinated with that. Why is it that we remember the Black Dahlia in the ways that we do, in ways that are totally inaccurate? And why does it continue to be something about which people produce podcasts and books and TV shows and movies? So I think that right now, we're definitely in a moment in American culture where people are absolutely obsessed with true crime. It is everywhere right now, with the most popular TV shows and podcasts and pieces of writing are about these cases that we've become obsessed with and can't let go, especially the cold cases. And it's true that I'm a United States historian, so I can only speak about the United States here, but it's true that in the United States that when at various times when these really high-profile murders happen, society becomes obsessed with them. And it's definitely happened multiple times in my lifetime. I think of like the O.J. Simpson case, Scott Peterson, right? I think even more recently, Casey Anthony. Like there are these like crimes that really like seize the public imagination. And that's definitely been the case, I think, throughout American history. What I think I know about the Black Dahlia is that precisely because she's so unknown, she's a victim upon whom people can project whatever they like to imagine about themselves, about the society around them, about who they are, about what she represents. So case in point, I was recently in Kansas City doing some research into a murder case that happened in Kansas City in 1941, where a young woman was murdered and her body mutilated in ways that were very similar to what happened to Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. And this girl was president of her sorority. She was active on campus at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She was like known by everybody, beloved by everybody. And she was murdered in a very similar way to the Black Dahlia, but like nobody knows anything about her. And as I was reading through the newspaper stories from the Kansas City newspapers about this murder, and trying to kind of get a grip on the similarities between this case and the Black Dahlia case, because the Los Angeles Police Department sought help from the Kansas City Police Department, like, hey, what can you tell us about this murder? It seems so similar. Do you have any leads? As I'm reading the newspaper coverage, trying to link the two, the reporter who's reporting on the police investigation of this girl's murder says that her life is an open book, right? She had no secrets. And it occurred to me that that was one of the big differences between many crimes that we don't really spend a lot of time thinking about for years and years, decades and decades after the fact. And the Black Dahlia case, the Black Dahlia was unknown to everybody. Her life was absolutely a secret to even the people closest to her, her mother, her sister. So because we don't know anything about her, she can be anything and anyone. And I think that she has taken on that stature in our memory. She has been a Hollywood starlet. People have called her a prostitute, and everything in between. So I think that in that regard, and now I've completely lost track of the question you asked me. So I think in that regard, she represents a blank slate. So the current podcast and TV show that are out about the Black Dahlia are purely speculative. So I have not yet watched them, and I'm trying to right now get a grip on the facts of the case before I delve into these sort of fictionalized or speculative memories of the case. It's really hard to avoid the speculative stuff on the Black Dahlia right now, especially for somebody like me who's a huge fan of murder podcasts. Oh, so tempting. So I've been trying to avoid that, but they're purely speculative. A lot of people have come forward over the years alleging that their friend or their relative or this person they know or this associate is the Black Dahlia murderer. And in the case of both the show and the podcast, I'm more certain about the podcast, a little bit less certain about the show, but that's the vein that these are telling the story in. So in the case of the podcast, there's a family who believes that their father or grandfather, depending on who's telling the story, was the Black Dahlia murderer. And he seems definitely like he must have been a creep. and definitely like he was into some shady business, but it's purely like we saw a photograph once in his photo album that looked kind of from certain angles exactly like the Black Dahlia, you know, that kind of thing. So it tends to be very speculative. There has been almost nothing published, and I don't want to definitely say nothing because I'm not done doing the research, but to my current knowledge, which is incomplete, there hasn't been anything published about the Black Dahlia murder that has been academic, scholarly, particularly factual. So I might, if I get this done soon enough, like be poised to be the first person to say something scholarly about the Black Dahlia murder, which is amazing because it happened in 1947. I mean, it's so much has been written and thought about and said about it, but very little of any kind of substance. I've had 2 cups of coffee. No, I'm sorry. I've had a cup of coffee, and 3 Diet Cokes.
Excellent.
Okay.